Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Welcome to the first episode of the No Treason Podcast. I'm Jonathan Drake. Thanks for joining me. The No Treason Podcast is dedicated to the understanding and dissemination of the political writings of Lysander Spooner, as well as a number of other topics that would be considered treasonous to the official narrative that has come to govern so many aspects of our modern lives. I want to start off by saying thank you so much to John Harold and Badlands Media for hosting this podcast. Thanks to John for encouraging me even with the idea in the first place to do something like this. And then also for him and the rest of the folks at Badlands for creating such an awesome community that we've all come to appreciate so much. I would say we weren't all necessarily looking for it, but we're definitely glad that we found it. In that light, if you've never been to a GART, a Great American Restoration Tour, I highly recommend you fix that. I've been to a couple, and I have to say that in our daily life surrounded by normies, being in a room full of people who may not be necessarily on the same page, but they're at least in the same chapter, is incredibly refreshing and encouraging. We have the distinct disadvantage of arguing against the status quo, which presents a unique problem. If you're arguing for the status quo, all you really have to do is make the statement, the claim, and then as Chris Paul might frame it, the punishment and reward structure of the party of false decorum does all the work for you. But when you're arguing against the status quo, you have to spend a lot of time to build an argument, tear down logical fallacies. And most of us, if we even have the wherewithal to do something like that, don't have the time for that. And certainly those in our lives, our family, our friends, coworkers, neighbors, they're not really interested in listening to that. So the awesome thing about a GART is that for an entire weekend, we are the status quo. So if you can make the next one, I highly encourage you do that. November 6th through 9th at Cocoa Beach, Florida. Go to badlandsmedia.tv/events to find out information on getting tickets and also being able to join the virtual stream that gives you access to the Telegram chat. And it's an awesome experience. If you scroll a little further down on that page, you can also see the plethora of Badlands meetup groups that have sprung up all over the country to help to continue the community and give you an opportunity to make friends, long lost friends that you never realized that you had. By way of personal introduction, again, my name is Jonathan Drake. Some of you know me as the pipe guy, the whip guy, and then in that context, the guy that nearly turned Ash in America into Ash in a Deadwood jail. Thankfully, that did not go any further. But really, in this context, I'm just a guy who likes Lysander Spooner, enjoys what he has to say, and I love to talk about it. I never thought of myself as a podcaster. That never really crossed my mind to do something like this. So I appreciate the help first of Brad. He kind of helped me with the back end studio side of things here in StreamYard. But I appreciate your guys' patience as I kind of figure out this new platform. And it's a little bit weird, I have to say, just sitting here in my basement, previously office, storage room, now studio, just kind of like Dr. Malcolm in Jurassic Park, just sitting here talking to myself. It's It's a little odd, but I'm sure I'll get used to it. I wish I could do these live, but due to my schedule, I'm just not able to do that right now. So these are pre-recorded episodes. If you would like to ask a question or drop a comment or support by way of a Rumble rant, I will have a way of being able to pull those out and look at them and make sure to incorporate them into the next episode when I go to record that. Today is Tuesday. This will be airing on Sunday. As far as what you can expect from each show, this first one's going to run a little bit long relative to what I'll be doing in the future, just because of introductory remarks and all that. I'm hoping to do about a half an hour to 45 minutes, airing on the side a half hour if possible. And really what I'm aiming to do is lay the foundation for each of the topics that I want to talk about over the life of this show. One of the things I would love to get into is Aether Physics. But I'm going to start with Lysander Spooner. And so the idea is essentially to lay the groundwork. And then once we have a sufficient grasp of the topic, I would love to be able to analyze current day issues in light of the framework that someone like Spooner has to offer. And then to keep it learning through during each episode, the idea would be in the future to have a section that's devoted to expanding our knowledge base and then applying that to the news of the day, as it were. Due to the nature of the things that I want to talk about, I would consider this, and I'm no expert by any stretch of the imagination, but think of this as like a crash course in first principles. We always talk about first principles thinking, and so that's what this show is ultimately about. By way of introduction for Spooner himself, this is a original. It's like the only picture that's available of the guy. You can see for my background, a ChatGPT enhanced version with a campaign button that says that elections are fake and gay, which is something I'm sure that he would have said. But Spooner, as far as him being worthy, Lysander Spooner, it's kind of an odd name, not common for today, obviously. I believe he was Lysander was an ancient Spartan king or something to that effect. His dad had an affinity for Greek mythology and Greek history. But as far as Spooner being worthy of having a podcast dedicated pretty much to him, he's obviously not a household name. And I think as we get into what he has to say, it will become pretty obvious as to why. I mean, just the thought of a group of fifth graders sitting in a civics class, which I guess that part's laughable today anyway, but sitting in a civics class and reading one of his essays and discussing it is funny to think about. Even in higher education, I went and got my political science degree from the University of Illinois. And around that time is when I became aware of Spooner's writings, and I was trying to interject them into conversations in the classroom, and I can assure you they were not well received. But as far as who he was a lawyer, among other things, in the Boston area in the 1800s. I believe he died in 1887. He was a prolific writer, a deep thinker, incredibly well-researched and read, and a well-reasoned champion of liberty. And I wanted to highlight that word liberty because I think in today's conversation about political things, we talk about rights, we talk about freedom, but liberty seems to be lost in the mix, and it's a really important word. And we'll eventually discuss more on that topic when we go through Spooner's essay on natural law entitled Natural Law, the Science of Justice. His work is woefully underappreciated, probably because his ideas really aren't safe for the regime. You'll find guys like Michael Bolden over at the 10th Amendment Center on YouTube discussing Spooner's works. They like what he has to say. But then thinking of my own background, Christian, conservative, I was homeschooled in Southern California back in the 80s when it was not allowed to. My parents were pretty brave in that regard. But there's this idea that we've got 6,000 years of human history attempting political cooperation. History is littered with the bones of empires and despots and failed ideas. And there's this idea that 250 years ago, that entire enterprise of the human race was solved. God handed the Constitution down on golden tablets, and that was that. The conversation's over. No more questions. Spooner is the guy who raises his hand and says, I have a couple of questions. And in fact, I think we can do better. And what you were doing was actually wrong, which is kind of a harsh thing to think about given our typical perspectives on the Constitution. But we have a unique opportunity right now. We're being told we're entering into a golden age. We have a lot of conversations happening that even just 5 to 10 years ago, we would never have thought possible. And if you think about what Trump said in his initial inaugural address in 2016 about giving power back to you, the people, we need to talk about, first of all, what that power is. And then secondly, who are the people? What does that mean? Spooner has a lot to say about that. And then also I would say that I love Trump, but his vision does not have to be our vision. And if the idea is giving power back to us, then we have the chance to make the future what we want it to be. But we need to have a framework and an understanding of even how to proceed in doing that. And that's hopefully where Spooner comes in. Going back to biographical notes for him, he started off as a fierce advocate for holding the government accountable for not following the Constitution. He's got a lot of essays and letters that he wrote holding the U.S. government of his day accountable to their, what he called, usurpations of the agreement, the Constitution. He viewed the Constitution, like many do in more traditional views of the Constitution, as sort of like a beware of dog, or like a no trespassing sign. You cross this line and you're going to have problems. So the Constitution is more of like a list of things that the government is allowed to do, period. And if they go beyond that, then it's the responsibility of the people to take corrective action. He appears to have been radicalized by the actions of the federal government during the American Civil War, which he saw as laying bare the true nature of the so-called social contract union that is held as so sacred under the auspices of the U.S. Constitution. His best-known work, an essay entitled No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, is going to be the primary focus over the next, maybe 4 or 5 weeks or so of this podcast, as I believe it's the best aggregate of his arguments against social contract theory. He organized the essay into 19 sections with an appendix that contains this quote, which is the best one out of the entire essay. In fact, I could probably just read this and be done. I'm not going to do that, but here's the quote. But whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist. So this kind of gives you an idea of the basis of his argument. When people talk about the Constitution, they often refer to the genius of the checks and balances system as being the means by which our government is kept pure and that we have the ability to hold it to account. But I realized on my own at the height of the Ron Paul 2008 presidential run, and thinking through what he declared himself to be and demonstrated himself to be, a man of principle, and that he would not have exercised powers that were not delineated for the president in the Constitution, that he was going to run headlong into a system that was wholly corrupt, and that instead of the checks and balances preventing corruption, once the corruption was already there, those checks and balances then became the means by which that corruption was maintained. And so Ron Paul would have been essentially a lame duck president. I'm sure they would have done all kinds of horrible things to, they did crash the economy. They would have just pinned that on his free market ideas, and that would have been that. And in thinking through, the common refrain here on Badlands of elections being fake and that you can't vote your way out of a fake election system. Chris Paul would say that you can't internet sleuth your way out of a psyop. And so I would add to that and say that you can't checks and balance yourself out of a corrupt checks and balances system. So the primary concern then of No Treason as an essay, and then the point of this podcast, is to have a grown-up conversation about what is actually happening with the Constitution based on natural law. And I would like to say, too, that the question of what to replace the Constitution with is a completely different conversation. I'm not afraid of having it. There's certainly a lot of good ideas, and Spooner has some really interesting ideas to that end. But I would say about his work that it provides the logical and really the moral guardrails that dictate how such conversation like that must go if our goal is to create a moral and free society, culture, government, etc. And all of this is important to me because I would rather talk about the true nature of things. Again, to borrow from Chris Paul, the reality prime, so to speak, of what is actually happening with voting, taxes, rather than using the euphemisms that we've been trained to refer to those things, which they actually themselves are euphemisms, which is essentially, as my older brother used to say, a euphemism is a euphemism for lying. It's essentially lying to ourselves about what is actually going on when we go to a voting booth or pay our taxes or something along those lines. By way of further introduction, I want to say thank you to Beth. Let me remove this here. I want to say thank you to Beth in Chris's chat. She's been helpful in sort of helping to brainstorm some ideas. And she finally got me to join the modern age and get a Chat GPT subscription. So we made this logo, as you can see here in the background. And if you notice, it looks like a postage stamp from mid-1800s. And the reason for that is that one of the ways that Spooner was active in his radicalism was he decided to challenge the supposed monopoly on the postal service that the government had by creating a competing agency, which he called the American Letter Mail Company, which you can see there at the top. And over the course of a number of years, this was, I think, the 1840s into the early 50s, he actually almost put the Postal Service out of business and drove down, just through normal market competition, he drove down the price of a letter to 3 cents. And then in the 50s, Congress finally officially monopolized the service and ran him out of business. And but his legacy was that that the stamp stayed at 3 cents for a number of decades following his death. So this is an homage to Spooner's efforts in nearly taking down the Postal Service. Okay, let me pull this up here. Still getting used to the whole studio thing. If you've listened to Badlands for any length of time, then you've no doubt heard the idea that due to elections being fake, our government is illegitimate. And that is an uncomfortable thought for some. But I'd like to offer a deeper reason for that would support that conclusion. If you were to, aside from the quote in the appendix, if you were to distill Spooner down to a simple sentence, it would be that social contract theory, which serves as the foundation of the American political system, is not just a fantasy, but is fraud. What is social contract theory, and why does that matter? Social contract theory is the idea that government gets their authority from an agreement, either real or imagined, among people to give up some of their individual freedom in exchange for the protection of their basic rights and the benefits of living in an organized society. Again, this is what we are told is going on sort of behind the scenes with the U.S. Constitution. As a political theory, social contract theory is a more modern concept. It was first mentioned in his 1651 book, The Leviathan, by Thomas Hobbes. And simply put, all variations of this theory agree with many other political theories out there. They see inherent problems with man in his natural state without any kind of a government. Hobbes is famous for his nasty, brutish, and short comment about the life of man in the state of nature, that is, without a central authority. And so the theory posits that there needs to be some sort of a central authority to protect the natural rights that we all supposedly have. And that the only moral way, the only rightful way to do that is if we all get together, contract together to form a government to protect our rights. Between the different philosophers beyond Hobbes, such as Locke or Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, etc., there are disagreements as far as how that should be done exactly, but they all assert that government power is drawn from the people being governed, and that power is codified by means of a contract establishing the rules of the relationship between the people and their government. All governments, if you think about it, whether it's an emperor or an elected government, need the people to go along with their claims of power. After all, there is only one or a smaller number of them, and there are millions of us. Subjection of the people to the government was achieved previously by appealing to a higher standard. We would think of the divine right of kings in this case. But this new standard, pushed by Hobbes and Locke and the rest, the idea of a social contract, proposes that this power has a legitimacy based on social consent. And again, this is what we're told happened at the founding of this country. However, we have seen, as Spooner would point out in that quote that I showed from the appendix, that the end result of a social contract theory is no different in practice to a king ruling by supposed divine right. And again, think about what Spooner said. Either it was it created the government that we have, or it was powerless to prevent it. So it's useful then to point out that from at least what I can tell, not one of the primary theorists' work was ever truly used to enact any meaningful reform or to formulate a government that in actual function was any different from the despotic regimes that have plagued us from time immemorial. In fact, rather than provide the means by which to throw off the shackles of a tyrannical government, those theorists' ideas and writings seem to have been more of like a pressure relief valve for political discontent. In other words, just complain, but still be forced to obey. So being new to the whole chat GPT thing, I decided to kind of probe that. And it agreed that they weren't so much blueprints for governing practice as they were narratives that disciplined political imagination. They gave people permission to question authority, but only within the boundaries that kept the government itself off limits. Modern day political philosophers like Chris Paul might label that as controlled opposition, and I would agree with him on that. The fact that social contract theory fits neatly into a controlled opposition framework makes me immediately skeptical of it being a truly useful tool in shaping any political future. And that is where Spooner steps in with No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority. He begins, and this is from section 1. The Constitution has no inherent authority or obligation. It has no authority or obligation at all, unless as a contract between man and man. And it does not so much as even purport to be a contract between persons now existing. It purports, at most, to be only a contract between persons living 80 years ago. Now, before we go any further, we need to understand what Spooner believes are self-apparent or axiomatic requirements for a contract to be legal and valid. And he would base these off of his understanding of natural law. Number one, contract must be voluntary. Number two, consent must be explicit and not implied. Number three, the parties to the contract must be honest. A contract that's based in fraud is not a legally binding contract. Number four, it must be just. That is to say, if two criminals put down on paper that they're going to split, say they're going to rob a house and they're going to split their spoils 50-50 and they write a contract, that's not a valid contract because they were engaging in criminal activity. And then lastly, number five, it must be individually consented to by all who are bound by it. And I have up there universally individual. And that's because it's self-apparent that one man may not speak on behalf of another man without his explicit consent to do so. So with that as a framework for understanding legal contracts, Spooner quotes the Constitution's own language, and you can see he has some comments interjected in there. We, the people of the United States, that is, the people then existing in the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Who is bound by this agreement? Spooner would say, per the standard of a contract, only those living at the time of its ratification and only those who individually consented to it. And why is that? Because a self-apparent truth is that the dead, first of all, can't bind the living, and the living can only bind themselves. To explore this, Spooner goes through a number of thought experiments, and he begins with this one here. He supposes a contract written as following. We, the people of Boston, agree to maintain a fort on Governor's Island to protect ourselves and our posterity against invasion. So Spooner would say that this only binds the people of Boston, and the people of Boston can only be those living at the time that the agreement was made in the Boston area who consented to the agreement. It cannot bind anyone who does not fit that description. And you think of it's obvious that if one generation wants a fort and they all get together and they build the fort, well, what if the technology changes and the next generation doesn't want to pay to maintain something that they no longer need to use? So the idea that the agreement of their fathers or their grandfathers holds them to some account is ludicrous at face value. Spooner goes on with another example. When a man says he is building a house for himself and his posterity, he does not mean to be understood as saying that he has any thought of binding them, nor is it to be inferred that he is so foolish as to imagine that he has any right or power to bind them, to live in it. So far as they are concerned, he only means to be understood as saying that his hopes and motives in building it are that they, or at least some of them, may find it for their happiness to live in it. Hopes and motives are nice sentiments, but they do not constitute a legally binding decree because the one doing the hoping does not have that sort of authority from the perspective of natural law, as Spooner explores in his thought experiments. So in that case, applying this to the Constitution, the hopes and motives of the framers of the Constitution are not binding on future generations, which of course includes us today. The aspects of a legally binding contract, being voluntary, explicitly consented to, honest, and just, will be explored in later sections there were 19 sections in No Treason. But in this first section, Spooner is addressing the requirement of universal consent. I'll pull that back up so we can see. Universal individual. Everyone bound to it must individually consent to it. In commenting on the people of the United States, Spooner says, it cannot be said that the Constitution formed the people of the United States for all time into a corporation. It does not speak of the people as a corporation, but as individuals. And he goes on to say, a corporation does not describe itself as we, nor as people, nor as ourselves. So in that case, the Constitution is not describing an inanimate corporation, but individual people who, in theory, have decided to act corporately. Spooner would agree with the idea that there actually is no such thing as the people. That's simply a shorthand rather than listing every single person involved. Think of it as we'll get into an Aether Physics at some point, but the people is something that people do rather than it's something in and of itself. And if that doesn't make any sense, I'll explain that later on down the road. That's a hat tip for you, Polymathanon. So being a contract purporting to be between the individual people in the country at the time of the agreement, and for the sake of ease, rather than listing the millions of those people, it just says the people, it's necessary for each of those people to have given their consent to be governed in order to be consistent with the principles underlying the premise of the contract in the first place. And this is a requirement of natural law, as we've seen with the list of what makes a contract legally binding. And it's the essence of social contract theory in general. And it is the foundational principle of this country. Think of language of, for, and by the people, or more specifically, no taxation without representation. If you think that through and someone does not consent, but they're being taxed and they're not being represented, that's a violation and is hypocritical. And that's something that Spooner would like to point out and as being unethical and a usurpation of power and of liberty. So we have to ask the question then, was there wholesale consent given? And of course, the answer is no. Spooner points out, furthermore, we know historically that only a small portion, even of the people then existing, were consulted on this subject, or asked or permitted to express either their consent or dissent in any formal manner. And we know from even the language in the Constitution and then just understanding of history that only men of a certain age, a certain skin color, that they owned property, couldn't be a woman, only that small subset could participate in the process of ratification. And then we know that of that small subset, only a small percentage of those actually did partake in the process of ratification. You think of the debate between the anti-federalists and the federalists. And then those that actually took part, just a smaller number of those actually agreed with the whole thing. And then if you consider the requirement to alter the previous arrangement between the states, the Articles of Confederation, we know that it required all 13 states to make a change to that contract. And yet we know that all 13 states did not ratify the Constitution. So on a state level and on an individual level, we know there was not wholesale consent given to ratify the Constitution. So based on what we've just covered, we have to ask, does the Constitution meet the requirement of having been universally, individually consented to? Can we truly say it represents a legally binding document under the auspices of natural law if it fails in that regard? Those are poignant questions to think about. So I'll wrap up this episode with this awesome quote from Spooner. So it was with those who originally adopted the Constitution. Whatever may have been their personal intentions, the legal meaning of their language, so far as their posterity was concerned, simply was that their hopes and motives in entering into the agreement were that it might prove useful and acceptable to their posterity, that it might promote their union, safety, tranquility, and welfare, and that it might tend to secure to them the blessings of liberty. The language does not assert, nor at all imply, any right, power, or disposition on the part of the original parties to the agreement to compel their posterity to live under it. if they had intended to bind their posterity to live under it, they should have said that their object was not to secure to them the blessings of liberty, but to make slaves of them. For if their posterity are bound to live under it, they are nothing less than the slaves of their foolish, tyrannical, and dead grandfathers. Why would they be, or why would we be, nothing less than the slaves of our foolish, tyrannical, and dead grandfathers? Because they weren't, and we weren't, given the opportunity to enter into a legal contract of mutual consent. In personal conversations that I've had with people when backed into this corner, the usual reply is, well, yeah, if you don't like it, you can just go ahead and leave. But again, that's not language of a legal contract. It must be individually consented to. And think about it again. I'll pull up that slide. A legal contract must be voluntary. It must be, the consent must be explicit. It must be just. It must be honest. And it needs to be universally individual. And a point that I didn't make much of here, but Spooner really enjoys making, is that the language used by the founders doesn't really even attempt to be binding. It's just their hopes and motives. It's become practice to assume that it's binding without giving much thought as to how that actually works in maintaining to secure the blessings of liberty. In short, the government back then, the government we have today, claims to have the legitimacy of being founded and perpetuated by a social contract, but in fact, it functionally is nothing of the sort. And to reiterate that awesome quote from the appendix, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had or has been powerless to prevent it. So in the interest of speaking honestly about our current situation, which if you think about what Spooner was decrying in his day 150 years ago, compare that to what we have today as being much worse, all of these things need to be taken into consideration. Okay, as another reminder, the focus of these episodes is not to provide an answer to the objection, well, what do we replace it with? Right now, it's simply to establish Spooner's reasonable objections to the story that we've been told about the founding of this country, the nature of our founding documents, and then highlight the problems with the legal language and theories that we're presented with, so that as we discuss political cooperation moving forward, we can do so from an honest foundation and hopefully be able to avoid the pitfalls that our ancestors and ourselves have found ourselves in. And I assure you, this will be something that we'll return to many times. And just to get ahead of this, that we will discuss the possible options for replacement when we get into Spooner's work, Trial by Jury. In the next episode, we will discuss Section 2, which will cover voting as a means of deriving consent. Taxation will come after that. And those things are often quoted as providing consent. I know I've personally been in conversations with people where they, tell me, well, you voted. Well, they find out I don't vote. And well, you pay taxes. So that means you consent. Spooner will deal with that. And we'll deal with that argument together. If you want to read the entire essay, it would take you, if you kind of work your way through it, maybe 2 hours, hour and a half to 2 hours. I'm going to have a link to a PDF of it available in the show description. But otherwise, appreciate you joining me. Thanks again to John for giving me this idea in the first place, and then hosting this on Badlands. It's an awesome opportunity. I love you all. And I'm very grateful to be here, and I'll see y'all next week.
Why a spoon, cousin? Why not an axe?
Because it's dull, you twit. It'll hurt more.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.